I'm going to seek to give a quick recap. We're approaching the end of our Testament series. For those of you who have joined us only really through My Zone and you've missed the first almost 6 months of our series, hopefully going to give you a little bit of a recap. If you want a more full recap than what I'm going to give over the next minute or so, I encourage you to go to our YouTube channel and you can watch all of the messages that have come previously to get up to speed. Basically, we're covering in this 6 months the whole of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, and we kick into Revelation next week, which will be fun and exciting. So we're almost there. And so our Testament series so far, let me do a recap with our familiar timeline that should come up. So God created the universe, brought order out of chaos, and everything was very good. Then enter the serpent and humanity's fall into rebellion and sin and evil and darkness and death and suffering. Blackness comes into the world where we are separated from God and suffer the effects of evil and suffering. So the world, and not just humanity, but creation as a whole, suffers the effects. And we are no longer, this planet and humanity, everything feels the effects, and we are no longer the very good creation that God had commenced. So God initiated a restoration project whereby rather than scrapping it all and starting something new on Mars, he kept going with Earth and said, right, I'm going to restore all things. And so he called a people and called them Israel. Through starting with Abraham, he built a nation that were to be a light to the nations. They were to shine his glory and to basically live in a way that demonstrated to the world who didn't know God what human flourishing looks like when lived in relationship with God. Basically, they were to be a display piece where all the other nations would look and go, that's what humanity should look like, and see what life can be looked like in relationship with God. Unfortunately, despite God giving them judges, kings, and prophets, they couldn't do it, and so their light dimmed further and further. To the point where Jesus comes, God sends himself in the body of the person of Jesus Christ, who went to the cross, took upon himself the sin, the shame, the guilt, the power of sin and evil, took it upon himself, took the punishment that was due the world upon himself, rose again, breaking the power of the grave and death, and started this process whereby light, this restoration was accomplished. And then he had commissioned his church to basically take up the task that Israel was originally given, to be a light to the nations, to reflect the glory of God and human flourishing when lived in relationship with God, and invite all people from all nations to come into that relationship, and to do this until Jesus comes back. So we as the church, as followers of Jesus, throughout history, right from the time of Jesus, have been called to continue that mission of Israel that they could not fulfill, continue the mission of Jesus, who was the light of the world, and to continue the mission of the early church, to be a light to the nations. Now, it's easy to say that, but what does that actually mean? What does it look like for us to be a light to the nations? Well, there are 3 photos on the screen of different types of light. I want you to take the next minute and a half on your tables. What do you think each light's purpose is? What are they designed to do? And while we do that, for the next minute and a half, chat on your tables, if there would be one person to jump up near you to the blinds along there, and we're going to have a bit of a fun experience this morning, if we can lower them down. So just one person go over to the blind and lower it down while the rest of you chat on your tables. All right. Might interrupt you there. Hopefully you got somewhere to distinguishing the difference between those three different types of light and what their purpose is. If you are old enough, or certainly if you're older than me, you'll remember, I'm pretty sure it was John Laws, but you remember those ads that used to say oils ain't oils? Was it John Laws? I think it was, yeah. Castrol. But then he defected to somebody else, didn't he? Didn't he? He was after the cash. So he went Castrol and then he went to another oil and just kept the line, oils ain't oils. But anyway, so Valvoline, yeah. I think just whoever offered him the most money, he went with and backed. But if I've learned anything across the years of having an interior designer as my wife, is that lights aren't light, or lights ain't lights. There are all kinds of different lights. Downlights, floodlights, spotlights, lamp lights, fluorescent tubes, chandeliers, festoons, strobe lighting, incandescent, halogen, LED, fluorescent, neon, the list goes on and on. Why? Because different situations require different applications. They are all lights, but the best choice depends on the context they are needed for. Understand? The wrong kind of light in space, and this is one thing that my wife is very passionate about, the wrong kind of light in a space can be horrible, can ruin the feeling of what's going on. For example, let me give you an extreme example. Imagine neon lighting in a bathroom. It would be fun, but challenging to put on your makeup, right? Yeah, hands up who has neon lights in their bathroom. You don't, right? Because it doesn't suit the function, the purpose of what's going on. The wrong kind of light can be either useless or offensive. You don't put floodlights in your lounge room, right? But the right kind of lighting in a space can be beautiful and functional. So the challenge we have as the church and as individual Christians is to work out what kind of light are we supposed to be amongst the community and world around us. We're called to be a light, but we can either be beautiful and functional or we can be useless and offensive. Yeah? What kind of form do we need to take so that we are a positive light in this world rather than offensive? You'll see on your tables and chairs, I've put out some sheets of paper for just taking some notes with those same pictures of lights on them. And this morning, I want to use this metaphor to look at how the nation of Israel, when they were called to be a light, and the early church in the New Testament, who were also called to be a light, took on the form and adapted to their contexts to be a different light in different contexts and different situations, and to see how this might help us in our own context, in our own witness. So the first light I want to talk about is lamplight. All right. Oh, see? There you go. Already elicits the emotional response. No, I can't read my notes. All right. Should have put some task lighting over here, shouldn't I? Anyway. It's all right. I'll get there. So as we've gone through this series, you'll remember that Israel were led into the promised land. That having come out of Egypt, God redeemed his people from Egypt under the leadership of Moses. They wandered through the desert for 40 years, and then he led them into the land he had promised them. And once they got in there, they distributed the land between 12 tribes. And these 12 tribes were called to be a light to the nations around them. They were these small clans that were to be a reflection of God to the nations around them. And God gave them his law. He gave them the 10 Commandments and another law to say, this is how I want you to live in a way that reflects me to the nations around you. So they were to live as a light, to live in obedience to God's command. Deuteronomy 4 is Moses talking to the people of Israel. He says, see, I have taught you decrees and laws as the Lord my God commanded me, so that you may follow them in the land you are entering to take possession of it. Observe them carefully, for this will show your wisdom and understanding to the nations, who will hear about all these decrees and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. What other nation is so great as to have their gods near them in the way the Lord our God is near us whenever we pray to him? And what other nation is so great as to have such righteous decrees and laws as this body of laws I'm setting before you today? So Moses is speaking to the people of Israel and letting them know that through their obedience to God's ways, they were to be a display piece, like a lamp, a display piece in contrast to the darkness that surrounded them in the nations around. Like a beautiful table lamp, they were to draw the eye of the nations around them to their beauty and warmth. They knew they were being observed. God told them that the nations would look on. And so they were to be a visible and beautiful. So being visible and beautiful was part of their theological identity. They were to be distinctive and attractive, a light that drew people to it. So that's the purpose of a lamp, is that it would draw you and invite you in, that you would be drawn to it because of its beauty and its warmth. Jesus alluded to the same purpose for his church when he said this to his disciples in John 13. A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. The way we, as the gathered people of God, the way we live and love one another should be a beautiful statement piece to the world around us as it looks on. The way we love one another, the generosity of spirit we share towards one another, the way we forgive one another. When we live in such a way, we become a beautiful lamp that draws people through our warmth and love and invites them to experience that same love through Christ. We have the opportunity to stand out in contrast to the hatred, outrage, and vindictiveness of the world around us. We see it every day, don't we? A world filled with hatred, outrage, revenge, vindictiveness. As the gathered people of God, we should live in such a starkly different way that we are a beautiful contrast display piece, that our world is drawn to who we are. Another thing you'll notice about lamps is they are not only designed to be beautiful themselves. Their purpose is to draw attention to the beauty around. Part of our purpose is to highlight that which is beautiful in our world and reflects the glory of God. So if we notice that there is beauty and goodness in the world around us, Even if it is not the church doing it, we should still draw attention to it. For example, if a secular community group is doing good work, then we should highlight that and celebrate it and work with them, not set up against them under a Christian name because we want to do things Christianly. Does that make sense? If there is beauty in our world, we are called to draw attention to it. It's what a lamp does. It is beautiful itself, but draws attention to beauty in this world. Why? Because God is the creator of it. He has made it beautiful, and we glorify him when we draw attention to the beauty here and work for the beauty. All right, so that's lamplight. The second form of light we see in the scriptures is the fluorescent tube. Much less attractive when you've had that there. But God had bigger things in mind. Could I just get a little bit of maybe the stage lights? Just the stage lights would be all right. Oh, unless you want to, yeah, there you go. Thank you for that. God had bigger things in mind for the nation of Israel than just being a lamp. Yes, they were to stand in beautiful contrast to the world, but they were also called to mediate his blessings outward towards the nations. He said this to Moses way back in Exodus 19. He says, although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. So God says, and it's repeated several times throughout the Old Testament, that they were to be a kingdom of priests. Now, did that mean that they were all supposed to walk around in, dog collars and robes? No. As we've seen throughout this series, the role of a priest is all about being the mediator between God and humanity, the channel through which people would connect with God and the channel through which God would pour out his blessing upon the people. So the people of Israel were to be the conduit, like a priest, the conduit through which God would bless the nations. So when King David came to the throne and united the 12 tribes of Israel into the kingdom of Israel, their influence and power became substantial across the known world. No longer were they just a group of little clans trying to obey God's law. They had serious influence and clout amongst the nations. They were a legitimate political superpower who had a role amongst the nations. Now, as you can see, fluorescent lighting is very different to lamplight. It's what they call ambient lighting. In contrast to a lamplight, which is more task lighting or accent lighting, fluoros like this, as we've got here, are designed to light up everything, to saturate the room with light so that there would be no dark, shadowy places, that light would be established throughout the entire room. That's kind of like the role Israel had under David. They couldn't do that when they were just 12 tribes, as they didn't have influence or power amongst the nations. They were just called to be a display piece that the nations would look upon. But having come now under David to this position of prominence and wide influence, they were to be a blessing to the surrounding nations. They were to shed God's light softly, gently, beautifully, not harshly like a floodlight, but beautifully across the nations, to be a pointer towards the universal, gracious rule of God over all nations that is to come in the eternal future. The way they lived, the way they demonstrated God and his light to the nations was to be a pointer towards this is the way things will be under God in the eternal future. So essentially, other nations were to benefit from Israel's existence and influence. Likewise, the world around us should benefit from the church's existence and influence. We should be at work establishing the justice and righteousness of God We should be working for the good of our society, not imposing our morals or our ethics on the world, but rather working for the good of the society that we live in. Now, a crucial thing to note is that it is not God's intention that we go from that to that. Does that make sense? God never commanded Israel to go and do a Babylon or a Persia, which was to go out and destroy a whole lot of enemy nations, gather more and more land, and become a massive, massive superpower, right? Because that's what Babylon did, it's what Persia did, it's what Rome did, and all that. They got hungry. It was like hungry hippos, it's just going, oh, we'll take over that people, take over that people, take over that. God never commanded the people of Israel to do that. He wanted them to stay within the land he had given them, but be a blessing, to shed his light everywhere through the influence that they had. So God never commanded Israel to do a Babylon or Persia and just make their land or their empire bigger. He never called them to defeat enemy nations so that expand their empire and dominion and make everyone Jewish. Israel were to stay within the land God had given them and be a blessing, distribute those blessings outward towards the nations. And I think some Christians badly mix this up. Some think that the goal of the church is to go from being a poor little lamp in the corner to having the influence of a fluoro. That we should force Christian laws and moral principles on our society so that our country will be a wonderful Christian nation. That we should exercise our muscle or lobby for more power and influence within the government to create a more Christian society or to protect our rights and freedoms. But that is not God's intention, and that should not be our ambition. Can I repeat? It is not God's intention that the church rises to have influence and power in society. It is his intention that if we do have power and influence, we use it for the good of the whole of society, especially those who are most vulnerable. Do you see the difference between the two? Please do not think that this is bad and that is good. Otherwise, we spend our energies trying to go from that to that. God does not call us to do that. God calls us to be a fitting and functional light in whichever context we find ourselves. That is good. That is good. But we are to be a light that is appropriate to the context, not trying to go from that to that. Make sense? Really critical for our understanding of who we are to be in this world. Let me give you an example. Go back to the 4th century AD. The Roman Empire had gone through a whole series of fluctuations for the few hundred years after Jesus. Emperor Constantine comes to power, and in 313 AD, mostly believed to be because of the influence of his mother, Helena, who became a Christian, he issued an edict that decriminalized Christian worship. Up till that point, it was a criminal offense to be a Christian, to worship as a Christian. In 313 AD, they decriminalized Christian worship. And it's said that Constantine himself became a Christian, and between 313, when that first edict came in, to 380, he wasn't around in 380, but the emperor of the time then made Christianity the official religion of the empire. Now, while it made more Christians, because if they did a census or a survey, you'd probably have gone from a minority of people within the space of 313 AD to 380, you would have had a small minority of people who would have called themselves Christians. Then to 380, the official religion of Rome was Christianity. So the stats would have gone from, 2% up to 98%. So while more people would have been Christians, most scholars and historians basically realize that that move stopped the movement of Christianity dead in its tracks, because it went from being a movement to an institution. Historically, the more power and influence the church has in a political sense, the less our evangelistic fruit. And the same is true today. A study published in the Sociology of Religion journal this month, the authors, after studying 166 countries across the world, found that as governmental support for Christianity increases, the number of Christians declines. As they said, 7 out of the 10 countries with the fastest growing Christian populations offer low or no official support for Christianity. And they say this phrase, which is striking: paradoxically, Christianity does best when it has to fend for itself. So if we as the Christian church in Australia are now finding ourselves more on the fringes of society, and many Christians are noticing this and saying, as a church, we have less influence and sway across our society. If we are finding ourselves more on the fringes of our society with less and less influence, the answer is not trying to shine like a fluoro, because it's the wrong type of light for that context. Make sense? Rather, we should be living as a beautiful display piece of how life is best lived, that draws and invites people out of the darkness and into his marvelous light. Imagine if you put one of those fluoro tubes over in this context, everything else was dark out there, and you popped a fluoro tube here. Would that be inviting? Would it be beautiful? It's not a nice light to have in that context. So if we're in this context as a church within our society now, let's not try and shine like that and have our power and influence and sway. Let's be a beautiful display piece that the darkness of the world around us looks at and says, that's how life should be lived. Too often the church has got that wrong. There's a final form of light that is presented in Scripture that is defined by another context in which we find ourselves. So the fluoros are going to go off. I'm going to wander over here and we'll see. This is where people get excited. Fairy lights in the Bible, are they? Well, you'll remember that the great kingdom of Israel under the leadership of David didn't last too long. After only a couple of generations, the kingdom split into two: the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah. And then eventually those two kingdoms were overthrown, and the people were cast out into exile. They were scattered, living alone and isolated, away from their fellow Jews, forced to work out how to live in obedience with their God in a world that served other idols. Now, in this context, there were two temptations for these people: to either isolate themselves from the surrounding culture in order to protect their beliefs and practices and stay true to God, but in doing so, they would fail to be a blessing to the nations that God had called them to be. The other temptation was just to fit in and engage with the society around them, but lose their distinctiveness. Nothing would actually show them as being any different. And we've looked at through this series at some of the great examples who managed this balance well. 3 guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, find themselves in Babylon. And they come under pressure when Nebuchadnezzar passes an edict that demands everyone in the kingdom worship him. Now, at this point, they could have done 2 things. They could have bowed down like everyone else, but then they would have lost their distinctiveness. They would have lost their obedience to God. Alternatively, they could have hidden, run away, but then, well, no one would have noticed. Instead, they quietly set about being good citizens of that foreign land, yet distinctive and resolute in their devotion to God. They didn't trumpet their devotion to God, but nor did they hide it. The context those guys found themselves in is somewhat similar to the context we find ourselves in when we go about our normal life, as we scatter into the various corners of our society. We gather here on a Sunday, we're together so we can be a lamp, but when we go out into the many contexts of our lives, we're often scattered into some places where we are isolated and on our own as believers. Perhaps we're the only Christian in our family, or in our office, or in our street. We don't have the gathered people of God around us, and we've got to work out, how do I stay true to God, but how do I make sure I still engage with the people around me and not give in to what they want me to. The Apostle Paul offers some guidance and encouragement for such contexts. In Philippians 2, he says, "Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky, or like fairy lights on a wall, as you hold firmly to the word of life." Treading the line between good citizens and yet also devoted to God is not always easy. Paul encourages us to hold firmly to the word of life, to be resolute in our devotion to God, yet to do so in a gracious and gentle way. When we do that, when we strike that balance, we shine our light in the darkness of this world. And hopefully our world sees and looks up and out at us, and cumulatively, we shine like stars in the night sky. In the darkness of a world that has lost its hope. On your sheets, I've added a couple of Bible references that give some practical guidance on how to strike that balance in our own contexts. Just a couple of verses. And to be honest, we're skipping through basically as Will brought us to the end of Acts 28 last week. We're starting Revelation next week, which means that we've done Romans up to, Jude today. They're not narratives. They're not, historical narrative documents that we can work through a story. But basically, in essence, what Romans through to Jude are is a whole lot of letters written by followers of Jesus Christ, and mostly apostles, to instruct the church on how to be the light to the nations in the various contexts that we find ourselves. Make sense? So we've summed up a whole big chunk of the New Testament today in that the instruction is, how do we as the people of God serve our purpose as a light to the nations? We might find ourselves on the fringes. We might find ourselves in positions of influence. We might find ourselves isolated. We have a role as a light to the nations, and we have to adapt to which context we find ourselves in. So as we've seen today, we as the church have been called to continue the same mission as Israel, the same mission as Jesus, the light of the world, the same mission as the early church shown in the New Testament, to be a light to the nations, to reflect the glory of God, and to invite people to see God's goodness and glory in a world of darkness. Sometimes we will find ourselves on the fringe, a minority group in the midst of a world opposed to us. And our role is to live as a beautiful display piece, to live as a community, as a people of such genuine love and grace and compassion and forgiveness and all the things that the Word of God talks to us about. When we live that well, we become a beautiful, warm and inviting light that draws people into his marvelous light. Sometimes we will find ourselves in positions of influence where we have an opportunity to shine God's light in a more general, overall way through our society. When that's the case, we exercise that influence to be a blessing to all people, especially those who are the least of these, the people who are most vulnerable, to make sure that no one is left in the shadows. Sometimes we will find ourselves scattered, isolated with no other believers around us. Our role there is to remain steadfast, not giving in to the idols of our culture like everyone else around us might seem to, but being a gracious and positive presence as we do so, so we shine like stars in the universe. This is our role as followers of Jesus, as the church, for however long it takes until Jesus returns, to gather all those who believe in him and to take up his eternal throne. I don't know how long that's going to last. I have no special inside information for you. But that's our task in this world, to adapt to the different contexts that we find ourselves in, to be a light that reflects God's glory and goodness. And we do that until he returns. And we're going to look at that topic next week when we come to the book of Revelation. As we finish, I'd like you to take just a couple of minutes to have a chat on your tables around this concept. Now, what I'd like you to do, and hopefully this won't be too hard, but you'll come up with some good examples, is that it's easy to think of ways in which the church has got this whole thing wrong over history. I'm sure all of us could go, well, the church has stuffed this up in, whatever way. When we haven't been a good light, I get that. We need to acknowledge that. We have done that poorly at times. But I'd hope that we can exit here in a more positive frame of mind. That on your table, perhaps you can share in some way how you have observed either the church or individual Christians, and don't talk about yourself, right? No humble bragging. How you have observed the church or individual Christians doing this well. That in that particular context, they have been an effective light to those around them. Make sense? All of us should hopefully have at least a good example of someone or a church who've been a good example of what it means to be a light in the world. Talked about how his people were to be revolutionary people in the world in which they lived. He says, "You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven." Lord God, give us all we need, wisdom, courage, and grace to live that commission out this week. In your name, amen. Go in peace.